Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, it really is a pleasure to be here, and what a fun program. So my presentation, because I don't have a lot of time, it's just sort of a taster, a teaser for an area of science that's been on a steady rise of influence for about the past 50 years, and yet most educated people don't know it even exists. I was, before coming to Fuller, I was teaching at Oxford, and I gave a lecture as part of their Science and Religion series, and beforehand, over drinks, yes, they do drinks before the lectures there. It's great to speak to a well-lubricated audience. I was told that what I do cannot be done and never has been done by an eminent scientist at Oxford. Because a lot of people don't know that cognitive science exists. It's a young science. But what I want to do then is briefly introduce what it is and its application to the study of religion very quickly, because this area has been receiving a lot of attention lately from science journalists and popularizers. New atheists such as Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett like this work a lot. Of course, so does Alistair McGrath. So I've been caught in an awkward tug-of-war at certain times. And in my short time, I'm going to argue that it's useful for the church and for preachers to pay closer attention to cognitive science generally and cognitive science of religion specifically, and that greater engagement by the church will likewise benefit the science. I'm not going to be able to say much about that in our time, but I really believe that's true, that this is a two-way street. Okay, so briefly, I'll sketch what cognitive science is and why it matters, and then turn to what cognitive science of religion is and why it matters. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary science of the mind. It combines contributions from artificial intelligence, linguistics, anthropology, psychology, particularly on the scientific side, neuroscience, and philosophy, especially philosophy of mind. Cognitive science is not equivalent to any one of these disciplines. It's not the sum of all of these disciplines, but it's the intersection point that concerns minds, not brains, not the gray stuff, but minds. How people perceive, use language, think, learn, remember, feel, and other mental activities. There's a lot of confusion around the relationship with the brain sciences. I think it's at least a helpful comparison is between the relationship between brain sciences and cognitive science is a little bit like the relationship between hardware and software in a computer. When your PowerPoint presentation isn't working, you want to know what went wrong and how to fix your software use, right? And if the IT guy comes in and starts telling you about silicon chips and motherboards and things like that, you don't care. You're not impressed, because that's the wrong level of explanation for the questions you're asking, right? So we're on the sort of the software side of things. How does the mind work? I'm going to focus on learning, remembering, and thinking because the focus of this conference is preaching. Naturally, being effective in preaching or a teaching role can be aided by understanding how people learn, by understanding how their minds work. Cognitive science is young, only about 60 years old, and so the state of the art is rapidly changing. But we do seem to have learned a number of things about how human minds work, and one area of considerable attention has been learning. Some of the findings have even become commonplace, almost conventional wisdom, but that isn't to say that churches or educators have fully come to grips with the implications of the findings. All right, for instance, we know that asking audiences to sit and listen to a speaker for nearly an hour leads to poor retention of information. Our minds are not naturally well disposed to that kind of learning. Actually, sitting and listening to people lecture is a sort of an expertise area that has to be acquired. Focused attention is taxing. New information interferes with the proper encoding and then remembering of older information, and so forth. We also know, as Warren Brown mentioned last night, that learning and memory is modality and state dependent. That is, how and where we learn something impacts how it is understood, retained, and used later. How it goes in impacts how it is conceptualized and how it goes out. If you want to teach actions, you want to teach people how to behave and act, it's best to teach in the context of action. Cognitive science has shown us, too, that something learned in one place, even underwater, leads to better retrieval in that same context, even underwater. You know, you can memorize a list of words underwater, and you better retrieve them underwater, strangely enough. So teaching in one rarefied context, using primarily one sensory modality, hearing, is a rather poor strategy for generalizable learning. Yet so many churches use this strategy as their teaching mainstay, and sometimes their only stay. All right. I suspect so far I'm not making any real new observations, but recent studies have expanded our understanding of the natural dispositions humans have concerning from whom they best learn as well. Humans from childhood on do not simply listen to or imitate just anyone. Rather, they have biases that govern their preferred teachers. Okay, the first of the two biases that I've listed up here toward prestigious and skilled individuals maybe are old news. Advertisers have known for a long time that if you get a master craftsman to endorse a particular tool, that is persuasive. A skilled person in a particular area should know what works best in that particular area. That's just sensible, right? Prestige is a little different because here, the prestigious person need not have any relevant skills. I may accept Michael Jordan's endorsement of basketball shoes, a tool of his trade, but why on earth do I care what underwear he likes? And yet we do. It's been argued that such a bias is part of our evolutionary heritage from a time and place at which skill and prestige were more tightly linked. Being skilled did lead to prestige, and now they're sort of divorced in our very compartmentalized and sort of highly specialized kind of society. A more recent development is the documentation of how important perceived similarity between the learner and the teacher is. In childhood, children have more automatic trust directed at those who are like them in relevant ways, in terms of sex, gender, group identification, and age. So a boy from a particular clan with a particular vocational trajectory is more likely to imitate another male a few years older, who exhibits skill and prestige of the same clan and a vocation, okay, of a few years older. So some research shows that children actually would rather learn from somebody, are more drawn to somebody who's just, 2, 3, 4 years older than an adult. All right, all else being equal. That's interesting. Another sort of little interesting footnote on this is that research suggests that children are more sensitive to language, word choices, and accent as a marker of in-group similarity than they are of race. Okay? So that I speak like you matters more than that I look like you. And there's, of course, an evolutionary story to tell about that as well. Okay. You can see, I'm not going to spend time drawing it out, but there are some really interesting implications for preaching here. I've been glossing some general findings about learning, general in the sense that they apply to most all types of learning or information. But it would be a mistake to think of the mind as a generic, all-purpose learning device. Okay? Two ways in which people commonly imagine the mind to work are importantly misleading. You'll sometimes hear someone refer to children as little sponges, just soaking up everything around them, right? Just put them in that environment, they soak it up. The truth of the matter is people's minds don't work that way. Children's minds don't work that way. They're not passive absorbers. They're active wrestlers with the information around them. Some information is taken in more readily than others. Some information is transformed and in very characteristic ways, okay? And, parents in the room sort of know this. Yeah, I've tried to teach my kid this over and over and over again, and they just ignore me, right? I mean, we have that experience in some areas, and in others, they seem incredibly gullible. Well, that's an important cue that not all learning is the same, all right? Depending on the domain of the learning that's going on, there are different strategies of learning that children and all of us naturally gravitate toward. Another not helpful metaphor is the sort of pitcher metaphor. Minds are just pitchers waiting to be filled by authority figures, parents, teachers, pastors. Not only is there something in there already, that's a problem with this kind of model, but minds naturally exercise selective attention and selective acceptance. Let me suggest another model. This one has its limitations too. I want to be quick to say that. But in some contexts, this is actually a very helpful analogy for the human mind, that it's a little bit like a Swiss Army knife. At least in some respects, it appears that the mind has specialized mental tools or subsystems that may have been tuned up by natural selection and or interaction with environmental regularities to solve certain types of problems concerning survival and reproduction that were especially important or that are faced over and over and over again. Exactly what the tools are and how specific or flexible they are, how they might interact, how they map onto brain systems and so forth are ongoing areas of inquiry. But understanding how minds work and what these mental tools might be and what their properties might be helps a teacher or preacher anticipate when challenges may arise. Ideas that closely approximate the default assumptions of these natural conceptual systems will be easily understood and communicated, okay, with a lot fewer words. Quick example, if I tell you on my way here I passed a brown floppy-eared dog, you already know hundreds of things about that dog. I shouldn't have said dog. Suppose I said the manabee at the local zoo just had babies, okay? You know all kinds of things about the manabee already. You know that its babies are of the same type it is, that they're made of organic stuff, that if I threw a manabee against the wall, it would sort of go thud and then fall to the floor, it wouldn't pass right through. That it probably moves itself around in purposeful ways, probably to get some kinds of energy, fuel sources, and so forth and so on. All right, you know all this stuff, even though you've never heard of a manabee before because I just made it up. All right, that's efficient communication because it's already trafficking on certain assumptions that we have or that we've acquired early in development, and everybody acquires a certain common set of those assumptions. All right, regardless of culture, it looks like. All right, so understanding where the sweet spots are in the way that human minds naturally work is going to facilitate effective communication and teaching. Ideas that fit those assumptions are going to have an intuitive ring to them. They're going to make sense on a deep level. Ideas that run against these systems assumptions, those that are counterintuitive in a technical sense, will be much harder for learners to pick up and use, and much harder for teachers to communicate. Okay? Maybe an analogy with some other areas of learning would be helpful to make my point. Science teachers have begun to profit from work in cognitive science of science. Okay? An area of cognitive science concerned with how concepts and thought about the natural world are acquired and develop. Research in this area draws upon infant and early childhood studies concerning naive physics, folk biology, and folk psychology, to name a few areas. Cross-culturally recurrent patterns in how we appear to think about elements of the natural world have been discovered. For instance, in considering the relative biological similarity of different animals, like these guys here, all right, if you guys weren't quite so sort of science sophisticated here, this would be a really good illustration. But because you are, it probably is a lame one. But anyway, when I'm talking to ordinary folks, I can ask, well, which of these two are more biologically similar? And I know what 95% of the audience are going to say. If you are a normally functioning human being from any culture on Earth, you're not going to say it's the armadillo and the panda. You're going to say it's the koala and the panda, right? Because we all, regardless of our cultural environment, use gross morphology, the basic shape of animals, and really high-level behavioral kinds of traits as indicators of biological similarity. Okay, and so when the biologist or biology teacher says, ooh, actually, the armadillo and the panda are more similar biologically than the koala is to the other two. Because this is a marsupial, and these are placental. Kids naturally are going to shrug their shoulders and say, so what? Why does that matter? Because that having a placenta trumps these other kinds of things, like, being arboreal, having big ears, and furry and being cute, just doesn't make any sense intuitively. That's not culturally acquired, or it's not culturally specific, okay? That just seems to be certain biases we have naturally. Because of these sorts of biases, Understanding and believing certain claims surrounding evolution by natural selection actually presents certain challenges to learners. Not only are we told that animals that appear radically different from each other are related, or even one is descended from another, but natural selection challenges the natural intuition that living things are discrete kinds, with something like an essence or nature that binds them together in species groups. All whales have some whaleness that makes them whales. The idea that the ancestor of a whale was not remotely like a whale, but looked something like this, violates that essentialist intuition, and so strikes most people as radically implausible. Okay? Further, a strong line of research suggests that we are naturally inclined to think that animals are the way they are for specific purposes outside of themselves. Okay, there's this wonderfully growing body of literature that shows that children have, and adults who are uneducated and haven't learned to tamp this thing down, we all have then a bias to think that, birds are here to maybe to be pretty. Monkeys are here so we have something to swing in the trees. That is, they've got a function or purpose outside of themselves. This, sometimes called teleofunctional reasoning, or sometimes it's been called promiscuous teleology, because it just sort of has run amok and parents just wouldn't approve. Okay, so consequently, studies have suggested that children naturally prefer either creationist or even spontaneous emergentist accounts of the origins of animals over unguided evolutionary accounts, even if their schools and teachers, parents, are teaching them evolution. All right? Unguided evolution runs counter to several different naturally occurring intuitions, and so it's difficult for kids to understand, accept, and think about accurately. Now that cognitive scientists have begun to establish where the challenges are surrounding understanding and accepting evolutionary theory, they're using this information to develop more effective curricula in this area. Another analogy. Not only does reasoning about the natural world appear to have early developing intuitive foundations, so might moral reasoning. The cognitive and evolutionary science of morality is a very hot area right now. One popular view is that our moral decision-making is driven by cognitive emotional complexes, often operating on a non-conscious level, that revolve around 5 or 6 focal areas. Okay, and I've listed them here. The strong claim is that though some of these moral foundations are emphasized or neglected in a given cultural environment, essentially wherever you go, people will understand others feeling that something is just right or wrong on the basis of it either fitting or violating these natural moral intuitions. For instance, the harm care intuitions make us feel that failing to care for or harming a member of one's social group without their consent is just wrong. It's immoral. Okay? We don't need reasons for this. Our gut tells us this naturally. Fairness reciprocity deals with several of the examples that C.S. Lewis uses at the start of Mere Christianity in his discussion of the law of human nature, such as, quote, "Give me a bit of your orange, I gave you a bit of mine," unquote. In fact, contemporary moral foundations theory and the research supporting it in many ways buttresses Lewis's arguments that humans do indeed appear to have a common normative or moral sense. By recognizing what these moral foundations are, then, those of us interested in training up children or adults in the path of righteousness have ready allies. If you can present a moral activity as an instance of one of these foundations, it will be received more readily than a normative claim that either violates or deviates from these 5. Of course, I'm assuming that the science has got it right at this point, but that is a little bit of a moving target. Okay. I've been involved in an application of cognitive science to the study of religion. Cognitive science of religion is the attempt to explain the recurrence of religious cultural expression by appealing to underlying cognitive systems, in much the same way that linguists have made major strides in understanding cross-cultural recurrence and stability of certain features of language acquisition and use by appealing to underlying regularities of human minds. This is a new field, and rapidly changing, and so it may be premature to draw very strong conclusions, but since publishers don't like when you don't, I went ahead and wrote a book. And in it I argue that it appears there's at least that the belief in the existence of at least one God is supported or encouraged by typically developing cognitive systems, okay? That is, given the way that our minds ordinarily develop and function, the vast majority of humans will find themselves attracted to the idea that there exists one or more supernatural, superhuman beings, such as gods, ghosts, spirits, angels, or devils. The idea of a creator God with super knowledge, super perception, and immortality appears to be an easy acquisition for young children. In some ways easier than understanding other humans along these same dimensions. At least that's what some experimental evidence is starting to show. Okay? They get mom right 2 years after they get God right on some dimensions. But so what? Are there implications for preaching and teaching? Well, one implication, which is already in the literature and the subject of study, is what's been called theological correctness, and the related ideas of theological incorrectness and the tragedy of the theologian. Because our minds find some conceptual pathways more natural than others, we find some ways of thinking about God or understanding other doctrines much easier than others. Consequently, when not concentrating or guarding our conceptual hygiene, we tend to think of God more anthropomorphically than the theological gloss on God we might otherwise affirm. Theological correctness, then, is like political correctness, hence the term. We know what we're supposed to say theologically, but these statements do not necessarily reflect where our unguarded thoughts lie. All right? That we always have sort of multiple God concepts struggling for supremacy in us because of our certain kinds of conceptual limitations. Theological incorrectness is related. It's meant to capture the common pattern that theologians and preachers teach certain concepts, and their audiences come away with something conceptually closer to our natural intuitions. They get it wrong. All right? You preachers know this. You preach one thing, and somebody walks, "Oh, Pastor, that was a wonderful sermon. I really appreciated when you explained da-da-da-da-da," and you went, "That's not what I said." All right? But what they gave you back was something that was actually closer to where the natural cognition drives them. All right? Poor, poor theologians. The doctrines they work so hard to learn and master in all of their nuances will forever be misunderstood by the unwashed masses. Not because they don't care or don't exert enough effort, but because such ideas are too counterintuitive. This is the tragedy of the theologian. Okay? And simply beyond simply making theological mistakes, cognitive science of religion helps us predict, too, that people will tend to generate ideas or practices that will run contrary to theological teaching. Some cognitive scientists have provided evidence that when faced with unseen hazards or pathogens in the environment, people often generate ritualized behaviors. And religious purification rituals may be culturally elaborated examples of such activities. That is, somewhere on an unconscious level, there's an unseen hazard in the environment. We automatically shift on this system that says, make sure everything is neat, tidy, and clean. And we do these in very predictable, ritualized ways that are sort of actually over and above what's really sensible or rational in many cases. And at least some purification rituals seem to piggyback on the same kind of mechanism. At least that's what's been argued. Fail to perform these rituals properly, and you trigger something like a disgust response that's related to the purity or sanctity moral foundation. Indeed, we see an example in Mark chapter 7 that appears to fit such a description. And I'll quote here. "The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, 'Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders, instead of eating their food with defiled hands?' He replied, 'Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You have let go of the commands of God,'" and he goes on, and then I'll pick up in verse 14. "Jesus called the crowd to him and said, 'Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them.'" An interpretation of this passage through the lenses of cognitive science is that the Pharisees have, very much expectedly, created a series of cleansing rituals to deal with invisible hazards, but have let those rituals take on moral significance. Fail to do them, and you just aren't dirty, you're immoral. you're defiled in this graver sense. Jesus corrects their misuse of the purity-sanctity foundation. A person's impurity is evinced by their speech and action, not adherence to hand-washing rituals. And Jesus' connection then of sexual immorality to defilement, for example, in verse 21, would have been really easy for his audience to understand, given their purity, sanctity, moral foundation, which is often associated with sexual behaviors. Okay? So at least, I mean, one way to gloss this from this cognitive perspective is what Jesus is doing is he's correcting a certain natural inclination that we all have with regard to making these purification rituals about, you know, really who you are and making them moral kinds of issues. And he does it by appealing to these same kinds of intuitions, which is just good pedagogy. It's always right to say Jesus just uses good pedagogy. It's better than singing a hymn just to say Jesus did it right. Okay, as I've been lecturing on cognitive science for some 15 years now, a common wonder is whether such explanations of religious belief and actions in terms of underlying cognitive systems amounts to evidence against warranted religious belief. There may be some specific religious beliefs that are vulnerable to arguments along these lines. I'll take up this topic in my seminar this afternoon, so advertisement. Here I just want to flag that recently I've become convinced that for Christian theism at least, the claims of cognitive science appear either to be of no serious concern, that is, they're sort of neutral with regard to warranted rational belief, or they actually provide some new evidence for theism, but it may not be of a terribly strong sort. And I'll just give one little teaser example here. One simple argument favoring theism of a Christian sort runs along these lines. Look, if there is a God, capital G God, one that's powerful, knowledgeable, and was involved in the creation or shaping of the world, who also wants us to come to know him, how probable is it that there would be natural dispositions to believe in some kind of God roughly in that neighborhood? Well, it's a little hard to know exactly how probable it is, but it certainly seems higher than the probability of such a state of affairs, given that there exists no God at all. That would be really surprising. If that's right, then this scientific evidence for such natural dispositions amounts to some evidence against atheism and for a certain brand of theism. Indeed, it appears that the findings of cognitive science of religion were, well, a recent commentator anyway, this guy, has been commenting on the cognitive science of religion. He gets it a little bit wrong, but he's in the right ballpark when he says, there is within the human mind, and indeed by natural instinct and awareness of divinity, this we take to be beyond controversy. God himself has implanted in all men a certain understanding of his divine majesty. Ever renewing its memory, he repeatedly sheds fresh drops. Indeed, the perversity of the impious, who though they struggle furiously are unable to extricate themselves from the fear of God, is abundant testimony that this conviction, namely that there is some God, is naturally inborn in all and is fixed deep within, as it were, in the very marrow. Cognitive science of religion seems to be providing evidence, at least in the neighborhood, of a sensus divinitatis, and what that looks like and under what conditions it develops and is triggered. At least that's one take. All right, I have to wrap up. To summarize, humans don't learn everything equally well. Knowing what we acquire with great difficulty tells a teacher where to invest and how to teach more effectively. It helps identify what requires more, what we might call cultural scaffolding, and more rehearsal. Knowing what ideas are more difficult and therefore less stable, could also help anticipate challenges in preaching, pastoring, teaching, and other areas of ministry. For example, these are question marks. Could it be that doctrines of grace, predestination, and that all humans are part of our moral circle require frequent attention from preachers precisely because they violate our natural cognition? We know we spend a lot of time on grace. Does it violate that sort of reciprocity assumptions? All right. Predestination violates assumptions about free will. At least some versions seem to. All right, seem to. And maybe we naturally assume that our moral circle actually just extends to our familial or clan group. And the suggestion that we actually have to love other people as neighbors or as ourselves somehow stretches us in a way. Maybe that's why these have to be revisited. Okay, just meaning to provoke you a little bit. If you're interested in these issues surrounding cognitive science and theology, allow me to shamelessly recommend my own book, Cognitive Science, Religion, and Theology, from the Templeton Press. And please attend the seminar this afternoon. Thanks very much.